Hello and welcome to this GSA Snapshot webinar on 2G and 3G switch-offs and the implications for 5G broadcast. The on-demand recording for this session will be shared with you immediately following the event, and you can also download the presentation at any point during the event by moving your mouse over the slides and clicking on the download icon at the top of the screen. We will be taking questions at the end of the session, so if you do have any as we go through the data, please do submit them using the Q&A box on the right side, and then we'll get through as many as we can after the presentation. The reports that lie behind the data that we're sharing today will be available from the GSA website tomorrow, and we will share with you directly the download links for those, so save you a job. But first, we'll just do a very quick sort of bit of housekeeping, if you were, and a recap on GSA itself. As many as you know, it was founded back in 98, really to be the voice of that mobile ecosystem. Currently, we're now up to almost 100 associates and members combined. And the work of GSA really includes both data sharing and gathering and also industry advocacy. In terms of the latter, we have focused working groups looking at areas such as private mobile networks, 6G standardization and fixed wireless access. The Fixed Wireless Access Forum itself has 56 members, representing about 80% of the infrastructure, chipset, module and CPE value chain for fixed wireless access. The GSA Spectrum Group comprises a team of 185 spectrum and regulatory affairs specialists from our executive member and member companies, and subdivided into regional groupings and teams that are focused on global issues such as high band and mid band and spectrum licensing. In terms of the reports and the data, in parallel to the advocacy work, GSA publishes over 160 reports annually based on data from the Gambod database. Now, Gambod is a unique database for GSA, which can be accessed by all employees of every GSA member and associate organization via the GSA website. And it contains the most up-to-date global data on 4G and 5G devices, networks, technologies, spectrum, and chipsets. GSA research tracks over 2,500 operators in the database and includes data on public and private 5G networks which are being deployed, evaluated, tested, or trialed globally, as well as the networks that are currently in the planned or licensing stage. If your organization is a GSA member or associate, you personally have unlimited access to all this data. And you can use it to create slides and charts to support you in your daily work. But today we're focused specifically on the issue of 3G and 2G and 3G sunsetting and what this may mean for new services such as 5G broadcast. So to that end, I'll hand over to Ian Fogg from the GSA research team to tell us more.
Thank you very much, Richard. So jumping through. So, as Richard mentioned, all the data in here is available in two reports to be available tomorrow, and we'll send you the link to those. This is very much primary gathering of data that we've done at GSA to gather which operators in which markets, which countries and territories have switched 2G and 3G switch off. The information sourced publicly from a large number of operators and regulators globally. And the reason this is really so interesting is really the age of these technologies. 2G first started being deployed, in the early 1990s. It's a 30-year or more technology generation. 3G is about 10 years later, so it's around 20 years old now. When we looked at 4G technologies like LTE and 5G, they are much more efficient. They're much more high capacity. They offer a better responsiveness, lower latencies, and higher throughputs. And so as operators look at their legacy networks, there are massive advantages in reusing that spectrum once that 2G and 3G technology is switched off. And the gathering pace. As of July, 192 2G and 3G switch-offs happened in 68 countries, either been completed, planned, or in progress. 93 operators have completed their switch-offs. 88 are planned network switch-offs, 11 are in progress. So there's tremendous momentum happening at the moment. When we look at the kind of history of this, you can see that before 2020, there were very modest numbers of switch-offs, but it's starting to accelerate now. When you look at the chart there and you look at 2026 and onwards, we expect over time that bar also to increase, because typically operators really only talk about their switch-off plans maybe 1 or 2 years out. So it's not that many operators that have spoken about their switch-offs after 2026, but there's still quite a lot to happen there. When we look at the regions, we can see a lot of activity in Europe. 40 European operators are planning 2G and 3G switch-offs in 2025. Partly that's because the sheer number of operators across Europe, and partly it's where they are in terms of their technology migration. Often operators have existing customers or types of customer using those legacy technologies. And although there are many reasons to switch off the technology in terms of putting 4G and 5G on it, getting more efficiency on the spectrum, improving energy usage because modern technologies are more energy efficient, removing security risks by having modern equipment with better encryption. If you have existing users on those technologies, an operator isn't able to switch them off until they've got a migration plan off that. And that could be old 2G feature phones, it could be machine-to-machine smart meters with a 2G cellular radio in it, it could be something in the automotive sector or some other industrial sector. It's an existing user base that has to be migrated before that technology can be fully switched off. What we also sometimes see before that is we see operators reducing the amount of spectrum allocated 2G and 3G ahead of a switch off. So they start repurposing some of that spectrum beforehand and leave a thin sliver of 2G or 3G spectrum live. At GSA, you can see some of that happening in our spectrum database, also available in Gambod to GSA members. We look at the global picture for 2G, we can see activity across every region. We can see more activity in the more developed parts of the world, but we can see significant activity in places like Chile, Colombia, in the Middle East, in South Africa, in the Indian subcontinent, as well as those richer markets. So it really is happening pretty much everywhere. Though we do see differences. In some markets, 2G is being switched off before 3G. In other markets, it's 3G that's being switched off for 2G. And really that comes down to the type of technology deployed and what customers those operators have on that legacy technologies. But you can see there's activity across every region on the 2G side. Similarly on 3G, we can see activity pretty much everywhere. Typically in Europe, what tends to happen is operators are keener to switch off 3G first because it's a data-centric technology, but is much less good than 3G and 4G. And typically it's the 2G networks that have those legacy customers on them with their feature phones or IoT. In other markets, perhaps like the US, it tends to happen the other way around. And there are other dynamics around this too. If you switch off both 2G and 3G, you need to make sure that your 4G phone base is compatible with LTE voice, with 4G voice. If it isn't, you can no longer switch back to circuit switch voice on 2G and 3G if both those network generations are switched off. So it's not just enough to have a 4G smartphone in use. It needs to be a fairly recent 4G smartphone available for the last 8 or 9 years that supports 4G voice. Early 4G phones didn't have that capability, and that's caused problems in some regions where both 2G and 3G has been switched off. And again, we have a device database within the GSA, within Gambod, with device specifications, what models are being launched on 5G and 4G, what capabilities they have available to GSA members. When we look at what's happening, when we see the type of upgrades, what they're doing with the technology, typically operators are looking to add either 4G or 5G onto that reused spectrum. The spectrum is often relatively low frequency, so it's very good for propagation compared to many of the 5G only bands that are above 3 gigahertz. But it depends. Both 4G and 5G are more efficient, so you can put more users, more data volume on the same amount of spectrum that you could with 2G or 3G. So there's advantages either way. both technologies are useful for the operator. When we look at what operators have said, 43% of operators state their upgrade technologies, both 4G and 5G. 39% are planning just to switch to 4G, and 7% moving to 5G only. Those dynamics will, of course, change over time as 5G becomes more ubiquitous. Moving on, this is the dynamic you can see where you can see the massive growth in 4G network launches in the kind of 2011 to kind of 2015 period, and you can see it sliding down at the end of that decade as 5G started becoming the dominant technology. So 4G is pretty much ubiquitous now everywhere globally. There's a few markets where it's not widely deployed, mostly in Africa, but basically it's a ubiquitous technology. It's very efficient. It has much lower latency than 2G and 3G. It's suitable for data as well as for voice. It's a foundational service, often for early fixed wireless access services too. And if you move more recently, you can see the growth in 5G happening with those first 5G networks launching in kind of March, April 2019, and then ramping through the period. But you can see that, again, globally, 5G is a very common technology now. 621 operators are investing in 184 countries in 5G technology, and that, again, is ramping up. And as that 2G and 3G spectrum is repurposed for more efficient network generations like 4G and 5G, it increases the capacity of the network to offer widespread mobile video streaming, higher data consumption services. And that, of course, is altering the business case of something like a broadcast technology like LTE broadcast, or as we're going to talk about in a second, 5G broadcast. Because if you have a lot more data capacity, a lot more spectrum capacity coming through, you can support more unicast video users on that existing spectrum capacity. One of the key things that 5G did was open up spectrum bands above 3 gigahertz that added a lot of additional supply, a lot of additional spectrum capacity to mobile networks. 2G and 3G switch-offs also increased the capacity of networks because 4G and 5G technologies are more efficient. So both of those things mean that networks are able to support more video streaming users at higher quality than they were able to before. And that alters that business case for a broadcast technology that is designed to supply the same video stream, a linear stream, to many users in a location at once in a more cost-effective way because of this additional supply coming through on the spectrum side. There are these challenges, though, with the switch-offs, which I alluded to. It's about older equipment, older services, the reliance on circuit switch voice if the device space doesn't support voice over LTE. It could be there's old feature phones in use. Some of the big high-profile brands that were common in the 1990s and the noughties that sold feature phones essentially never released a 3G feature phone. They only supplied 2G feature phones. If there are feature phones in use, that can be a barrier to switching off 2G and 3G. If there's a lot of IoT customers in use, again, that can be a barrier to switching things off. So these are the things that operators have to wrestle with, despite all those advantages around security, energy, and capacity that switching things off delivers. There's this balancing act that operators do. 5G broadcast is a technology which allows essentially video streams or other types of data to be distributed to a large number of users, either in a limited area or across the network, in a very spectrum efficient way. It could use existing spectrum on the traditional bands. It could use new spectrum bands, lower frequency than the current cellular bands that have come across from the TV industry. It's a broadcast standard, and it's different to some of the older video streaming efforts like MediaFlow or DVB-T because it's designed to use the existing 5G handsets, standard handsets, without any custom hardware or minimal amounts of custom hardware. The firmware on the device would need to support 5G broadcast and the right 3GPP release, and it would need to have the right antenna and radio front end to support the spectrum band that the 5G broadcast service is being offered on, but otherwise it's standard 5G hardware, where the earlier efforts like MediaFlow and DVB-T from 15, 20 years ago required extensive amounts of custom hardware on the device to support. This also differentiates 5G broadcast from some of the innovations in the TV industry, like ATSC 3.0, which is the North American standard designed to be the future of over-the-air of antenna TV services. If that were to be implemented on a handset, again, it would require a lot of custom hardware. And when we looked back at why those older broadcast video services didn't succeed in the mobile industry, a lot of that was because the pain points around having custom hardware. What we're now seeing with 5G broadcast, which started out in the release 16, and there've been improvements with subsequent 3GPP releases. Release 18 is the upcoming standard that's been finalized. We'll start launching later this year. We're seeing renewed activity in trials and pilots around 5G broadcast technology. And we've tracked at least 23 trials and pilots in 12 countries and territories since 2019, which is when 5G first launched. A lot of them around individual events. They're around the Euros or around the French Open, where there's a lot of interest in watching essentially the same video content. So a lot of trials have been in that kind of use case. One of the other things striking at 5G broadcast is it doesn't require a SIM or authentication. It can be a service that runs alongside a traditional cellular operator and is really driven by the broadcast industry, not driven so much by the cellular and the mobile operators. And that opens up some other dynamics around what's the value chain, where's the revenue opportunity if there is one, and if there isn't a revenue opportunity, what's the cost opportunity, what's the dynamic around that. And a lot of the trials we're tracking have multiple participants outside the traditional telecom industry, involving leading broadcasters or media production or TV production technology companies involved in these trials, exploring these models, these business cases, these uses. Some of the other things that we're tracking, which are interesting opportunities around this, are around other areas beyond just broadcast video. It could be vehicle firmware updates being distributed in a broadcast mechanism, taking load off the cellular networks. It could be public safety announcements. There's a number of other areas that the industry is looking at and experimenting with around the 5G broadcast standard. And some of this stuff is covered in this 5G broadcast report that you'll see on the GSA website. The other thing you can see when you look through the list, and I've summarized it just on this chart, it's not the full list of all the trials we've been tracking, is you can see there's activity across multiple regions. There are many countries in Europe with active trials or pilots of 5G broadcast technology. There's some activity in North America, particularly in the US. There's 2 or 3 trials there, one I think in the Boston area, one further inland. But there's also activity in South America as well. Not so much so far in Asia, although there have been trials in China. So it tends to be a technology where the trials and things we've been tracking tend to be in the Western Hemisphere so far. Doesn't mean it will stay that way, but that's what we've seen to date. So I'm going to pause at that and open it up to Q&A. So
you can see the question.
I think one of the questions here is, are operators switching off either 2G or 3G or both? I think the goal is to switch off both. The only question is which order it happens. I haven't seen any operators where they switch off both at the same time. They typically do either 2G, switch that off, make sure the migration's in place and repurpose the spectrum, or they do 3G first, get everything switched off, get all the users, all the kinks out of the system. They don't tend to do both at the same time, but the goal very much is to do both. And there are some operators globally that have now switched off both their 2G and 3G network generations. That's happened in North America, in some of the US operators, and also in places like Japan, for example. through the question around point of sale devices, how are operators managing that? Well, that's one of the potential legacy device characteristics. It depends on the operator, what customers they've got. If they have got customers of that type, what tends to happen is the operator reduces the amount of spectrum allocated to the legacy technology. Because if you're just supporting a few legacy customers, you don't need as much spectrum capacity devoted to 2G or 3G than you had back in the day when you had hundreds of thousands or more likely millions or tens of millions of users on it. So they typically shrink it down to the actual minimum channel size and have just that in place for a longer term piece. Seems to be what happens. And then the migration plan off that legacy technology, that point of sale device, it'll depend on the customer base and when it was put in, when the replacement cycle is, and I guess presumably what the contracts are like as well. Is 5G broadcast technology for linear TV and radio? As the youngsters are moving towards non-linear, is this not a dead on arrival technology? Well, I think if you look at the research out there, there's still a tremendous amount of video that is consumed live. Although drama and scripted content tends to now be headed in the on-demand direction, even that is often consumed live. But there is content like sport, like breaking news, which really tends to be a live consumption experience. If you look at some of the highest or greatest watched programs of the last couple of months, it will be the Copa America in Latin America, the international football tournament for the Americas, or in Europe, it'll be the equivalent of the Euros, will be some of the highest watched programming available on any medium, and that is watched and consumed live. So there's always going to be live content where it's important, I think, to consume it, even as we move towards more on-demand content. Looking through all the questions here. Do you have any thoughts on whether we'll eventually see 4G switch-offs in markets where operators have made the transition to 5G standalone? And if so, what is the probable timeline? I think that's some way off at this point. You know, for an operator to switch off 4G, they'd have to have their entire customer base with not just a 5G device, but I think the question is actually asking 5G standalone, but an up-to-date 5G device that's capable of 5G standalone. You know, we are probably 15 to 20 years from that really happening, I would think. Remember, when we're looking at what we're seeing today around 2G and 3G switch off, these 2G networks being switched off were often deployed between 20 and 30 years ago. So 4G has been a similarly massively successful technology. 4G networks were typically deployed between 2009 and 2014 in developed markets, a bit later in Africa or some of the markets with lower GDP levels. But it's been a massively successful technology. We're a long way off 4G switch-offs, I think, at this point. We've seen carriers look at cell broadcast before with 3G and 4G and it didn't take. What's different with 5G that will make cell broadcast take hold? Better quality of service, consumer behavior. Well, I think there's a few things. As I alluded to, some of the older technologies were less embedded in the standards. So there were barriers around device support that were very problematic. I think some of the other issues were around things like the value chain. So I think the device support has got considerably better than what we had 15, 20 years ago. I think the value chain question about how do the broadcast players, the content owners relate to what's happening with the cellular infrastructure, I think some of those questions are still very live. I think some of the questions which are still very live too is what's the business case? Is it about a cost-saving business case, in which case which costs precisely are being saved, given there does still need to be some additional infrastructure put in to manage the 5G broadcast experience. There needs to be a strong cost-based case, and who's saving that cost, And if it's a new revenue stream, how is that monetized? What kind of content is monetizable in this way? Is it around an experience from a stadium where perhaps people have the ability to watch clips and watch video, different camera angles of the sporting event as if they were at home while they're actually live in the stadium? Is it around some new business streams, some unique content? And I think, again, you look at the trials, and many of these trials are exploring these types of things. So I think there's still work to be done, but some of those barriers are going away or have gone away around device support because it's now a core part of 3GPP standards. Looking through things here. Is there any identified use case of 5G broadcast used for utilities? I think where that would be relevant is if there is significant amounts of data that requires distribution to a large number of devices. I'm not quite sure what that might be. It could be a firmware update, but it would have to be a device where the firmware was quite big and where the device was very widely available and where an existing technology wasn't suited. So I'm not quite sure what that might be. I'd have to have a look at the database and see if we've spotted any utility type trials. From memory, most of the trials we've spotted are around the use of broadcast video experience rather than using this to broadcast apps or firmwares or data type transmissions. Where are we going here? What other questions have we got? Through here. What have I missed? There's a question about, do you have more details about the trials on 5G broadcast? Yes, that's available on the GSA website. The GSA members, there'll be a members-only version of the report with a list of the trials and what they're for in some more detail. The summary report summarizes out the trials rather than going through them one by one. Question about regarding security. How do you think this will affect law enforcement and military groups that sell surveillance equipment? I think that's kind of, I'm not sure that's relevant because this is a broadcast technology. 5G broadcast doesn't have an upstream component. There's no way for users to send information back to manage the data. It's very much from a one-to-many experience. So it has, I don't think it has any particular relevance at all for law enforcement or the military at all. Holding questions here. I think we've covered quite a few of the questions here. There's a question around 5G broadcast device support. So in the Gamble database on the GSA website, we track 4G and 5G devices and what features they support. I think that includes the 3GPP release. So the initial 5G services launched with release 15. Newer devices have release 16, release 17, and there are some release 18 capable devices out there. One of the interesting things around that is to support a service like 5G broadcast, you need not just the hardware, but the software on the device to have the relevant support. So that's the interesting bit. I'm not sure what we have captured on that, but the database has a lot of device-specific features and characteristics captured within it. So that's probably why I have a look for the device support for 5G broadcast. I think that's all the ones I've seen. Rich, have you spotted any others here that we should pick up on?
I think we had one about, which I think we covered on back to 2G and 3G sunsetting and the implications on eCall. Are there any implications for sort of circuit switch off for eCall services?
So I don't know of any offhand. I would put that into the category that if there are specific customers using a particular service on the legacy 2G or 3G network generations, that's something that has to happen operator by operator. On voice calling more generally, one of the challenges, as I mentioned, has been around things like having LTE voice support. So that was something that was painful, I think, when one of the US operators switched off their 3G network, I think it was about 2.5 years ago, and they'd previously switched off their 2G network. So it was the last of the legacy networks they were switching off. And because it was 2.5 years ago, there was still a small number of early 4G devices that had LTE capability, but didn't have LTE voice capability. And the problem for them was that those devices would essentially lose to make phone calls. But that's a very specific case. And really, in developed markets, you'd have to go back probably 8 or 9 years now to have a 4G phone that didn't have LTE voice support. So that's no longer really an issue. Any other questions, Richard?
I guess just one small housekeeping one. Someone said that in Gambod they're not necessarily seeing data on 2G and 3G switch-offs for every country, and is that simply because there aren't any plans for it? So presumably what's in Gambod is just what's been reported, and no news is simply
that's what I was alluding to. When you look at the timeline of what's happened and what will happen, if you look at the future timeline, there's a lot in 2024 and 2025. There's a small amount of 2026 that's planned, and nothing after that. Now, that doesn't mean nothing's going to happen in 2027 onwards. It doesn't mean there's only that limited amount that's happening in 2026. I think it's just simply a case that operators only normally announce their plans for switch off when they're kind of 18 months or 2 years out. And so if there isn't something in the Gambod database already, but there are 2G and 3G services live on those operators, maybe they haven't got around to it. The other thing to bear in mind is there are some operators where they didn't have those legacy technologies. There were new entrant 3G operators in a number of countries that never had a 2G service. So there are a few like that you've got to be careful on as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think that brings us up, well, just 2 minutes over. So we try to keep these to 30-minute snapshots if we can, but lots of questions. Not surprising, we covered 2 topics, I guess. So I will once again thank you all for joining us. And just to repeat, you will receive a link to the full on-demand recording immediately following this event. Both reports on 2G and 3G sunsetting and on 5G broadcast will be published later this week. As soon as they are, we will share a link to them directly with you. So you'll get those in your inbox as soon as they are live. Throughout the year, we will have more events, including snapshot webinars, a whole range of different topics. Our next event will be a regional spotlight where we'll look at Asia Pacific as a market, really looking at the issues around status of 4G and 5G in public and private networks and how the availability of spectrum might shape the future in the region. As we mentioned up front, and Ian's alluded to throughout, access to the detailed data behind the GSA reports and webinars is available to all employees of GSA members and associate organizations via the GSA website. So if you do want to know how you can dig into that and find those all important operator names on who is doing what, then please do get in touch and inquire about becoming a GSA associate and accessing all those databases. For the latest updates on all GSA research and activities and events, we share information on our social channels. There's also a weekly Research Digest email that you can subscribe to on the website. So as reports are published every Monday, you'll get a link to the latest reports. And there's also a monthly newsletter as well, again, sort of summarizing the key reports and webinars and events from the previous month. So all that being said is on behalf of the GSA team, say thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you again at the next GSA event. Many thanks.